Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this IFS Deaton Review event, where we'll be looking today at early childhood inequalities. I'm really excited actually to be chairing this event. I think this is probably one of the most important inputs to our very big piece of work on inequalities that we're doing over several years in conjunction with the Nuffield Foundation and with Angus Deaton. Early childhood inequalities are where a lot of inequalities in society are reflected, and also inequalities in childhood are reflected later on in adult life. The material which you're going to see today is based on publication which is up on the IFS website, and the slides that you'll see will be up there later. This was just published this morning. We have three fantastic speakers today. First of all, Alyssa Goodman, who's Director of the Centre for Longitudinal Studies and Professor at the UCL Institute of Education, and also a Research Fellow at the IFS. We have Sarah Cattan, who leads our work on education and early years here at the IFS, and has done a huge amount of work in this area. They're both authors of the chapter of the Deaton Review. And finally, Kerry Oppenheim, who is lead on early childhood at the Nuffield Foundation, part of the Nuffield Foundation senior management team, and very appropriate that we should have Kerry speaking here, as Nuffield has very generously funded all of this work for the Deaton Review of Inequalities. Kerry was also previously Chief Executive of the Early Intervention Foundation and has a very long and distinguished career in public policy. As I say, thank you all for joining. We will have three presentations from Alyssa, Sarah, and Kerry, one after the other. I won't get in the way between that, but you are very welcome to, indeed encouraged to, ask questions on the Slido app, which you should all have access to. Please put your questions in there and do vote up ones that you particularly like. I will see the questions which have the most votes first, and they're the ones most likely to be asked. Speakers will be speaking for about 45 minutes. We then have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. I will stop there, end this introduction. We get into the meat of this, and I will hand over to Alyssa. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and I hope that somebody would tell me if you can't hear me or see my slides. But first of all, just to say good morning and a very warm thanks to Paul for the introduction and for the opportunity to work on the Deaton Review, and also to my chapter co-authors, both from IFS, from the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, where I'm based, and from the University of Edinburgh. I wanted to start by making clear that inequalities in the early years matter, as Paul's already alluded to, both because this is a precious time of life in itself and because it's very deeply formative for the rest of life. So in my section of the presentation, I'm going to spend some time setting out the key results from this chapter from the Deaton Review, documenting the extent of inequalities in the early years, both in terms of the cognitive development of young children and also their social and emotional development, as well as the inequalities in the many facets of the environments in which they're raised. I'll then give you some high-level findings from our analysis about how different facets of the home environment and early development are linked. And as I go, I'll be pointing ahead to some of our policy conclusions that Sarah will then pick up on and discuss in much more detail. So starting with the extent of inequalities in early development, here we're looking at child development at age 3 from a nationally representative UK cohort, which is the Millennium Cohort Study. And on the left chart, we have cognitive development scores at age 3, and on the right-hand side, social and emotional difficulties. And in both cases, we're showing the percentage of each group as elaborated on the vertical axis, who are in the highest scoring or the most favorable 20% of the population. So for cognitive scores, that's the top 20% of cognitive scores at age 3. And for social and emotional development, that would be the lowest level of difficulties as scored at age 3. And because we're looking at the highest fifth, if everything was equal, then you would see 20% of all children within that fifth, but clearly there are strong inequalities, and you can see the deviations from that 20% line where the graphs are centered, which show whether these groups have a higher or lower chance of being in that top fifth. So we can see already strong differences between boys and girls, so also by ethnicity, by the educational attainment of the mother, by income, and by family structure, so 1 or 2 parent households. And in particular, you can see if we focus in on these charts on the socioeconomic differences, we can see strongly graded patterns both in cognitive development and social and emotional difficulties of those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, much less likely to be in the top fifth of these developmental scores by the age of 3, and those from the higher socioeconomic groupings much more likely to be scoring highly. So geographical inequalities are another aspect of the Deaton review that cuts across many of the chapters. Here we're using national administrative data taken at the age of 5 from the early years foundation stage profile to highlight some of the really stark geographical inequalities in early development. And you can see from this is across England in this case rather than the UK. And in this heat map, the more green shaded are the areas in which more children reach the expected level of development at age 5, and the yellow and orange are lower numbers of children reaching the expected level. So you can see from the heat map generally higher scores in the southeast of England, and for example, lower scores in around the northwest. So you can see just one stat pulled out from here: around 82% of children reach the expected level of development at age 5 in southeast of England, and around 76% in the northwest. So turning now to the very strong inequalities in environments in which children experience in their early years. Here we're looking at some of those same groupings in terms of family background, here focusing on ethnicity, education, income, and family structure. And we've taken some time to think carefully about how to group different aspects of the early environment into meaningful ways of describing the types of environments in which children are raised, different facets of parenting in the family home. And so the first chart here that I've put up relates to the educational environments in which children are raised. And by that, we're looking both at the education of the mothers and their scores in certain cognitive tests that were taken in the Millennium Cohort Study. Here on the left, we have a maternal vocabulary score, and also we're able to look at features of the around the cognitive stimulation available to the child and other features of the home learning environment. So on the right-hand side in this chart, this particular measure that I've chosen as an example is whether or not the child was read to daily. And you can see again that there are strong differences in these educational environments that children experience, both by ethnicity, as we show here, and also by some of the socioeconomic backgrounds of the child, as well as by family structure. So again, those from the poorest backgrounds, the most disadvantaged socioeconomically, those areas of the chart in the middle there, with experiencing sort of less rich educational environments at home than those from more advantaged backgrounds. So another important facet of the family environments in which young children are raised are what we've called here their emotional environments. So here we've picked out elements of the home environment that we observe in the Millennium Cohort Study, thinking about some of the more emotional, nurturing, relational aspects of the family home. And a couple of examples of those that we've shown on the right-hand side are parent-reported index of parent-child conflict. We also in our chapter have parent-child warmth measured, and the results are very similar but flipped. And on the left-hand side here, high maternal psychological distress, so measures of the mental health of the mother. These are just two examples that we've taken from our chapter. Again, there's really extensive inequalities in the emotional environments and other relational aspects of the family home, depending on family background. So for just looking at the parent-child relationship chart that I have here on the right, you can see much higher reported levels of parent-child conflict among certain ethnic minority groups. So for example, among Pakistani and Bangladeshi families, those in the poorest quintile of income, and also in one-parent households. And finally, the final classification that we've grouped our environmental measures into is looking at material environments, and thinking in particular here about housing tenure and home ownership. And as expected, in particular because home ownership is highly correlated with family wealth, you can see another very strong gradient, both by socioeconomic background and by other facets of the family home. So within the chapter, we were very interested in trying to pull out how those extensive differences in family environments in which children are born into and raised in their early years, how do those contribute to differences in development at the age of 3? So one method by which we've done this is to decompose the total variation in cognitive development at age 3 and also in social and emotional difficulties at age 3, to decompose the total variation that we observe in those according to these different environmental indicators that we've classified, as I described to you before. So this comes from simple regressions that we've run of, on the top there, you'll see of cognitive development, and then on the lower bar, social and emotional difficulties. We've run a series of simple regressions regressing the level of development against the environmental indicators that I've described to you previously. And then we've decomposed the total level of variation into that which can be accounted for by these different blocks of environmental indicators. And so what you can see from this chart that I'm showing here is both that early environments can explain to quite a reasonable degree the extent of variation in cognitive development, but especially in social and emotional difficulties that we observe at age 3. So they're very strongly associated together, and a reasonable extent of those differences can be explained. And in particular, you can see that those indicators of the emotional environment that I described earlier have a particularly strong role in explaining the extent of social and emotional, the extent of inequalities in social and emotional difficulties at age 3, as well as to a lesser but still important extent, the differences in the educational environment. And then when you look at cognitive development in the bar above, you can see that it's those differences in the educational environment which have a slightly stronger explanatory role in explaining differences in cognitive development. You'll notice in this chart that there's an extra set of explanatory indicators that we've included there, which is the genetic endowment. and genetic data became newly available within the Millennium Cohort Study during the course of this project. I'll go on to discuss some of those results in a bit more detail in a moment, but I just wanted to flag that those are also there. So in terms of, I said I'd sort of set the trail for some of the policy conclusions that we started to draw from the analysis in our chapter, which my colleague Sarah will then pick up on in the next presentation. But here's the first one of those. So a very clear message from the findings of our analysis throughout the chapter is that the crucible of early development between the ages of 0 to 3 is the family home environment, especially the emotional and nurturing aspects of the environment, but also cognitive stimulation and educational inputs. So the crucible of early development is in the family home, but as Sarah will discuss in a moment, policy, especially in recent years, early years policies, has very much refocused towards in-work childcare subsidies, mainly targeted at the 3s and overs, while cutting benefits and family programs. So that's link number one to policy. In terms of link number two, so I want to go back to the income gradient in early development. So that was one of many of the different gradients that I showed you in my opening slide describing the extent of inequality. So here we have this by income decile. So we've ranked children according to their family income from the lowest 10th up to the richest 10th. And here we're we're showing the average level of development according to their percentile rank in the distribution here of cognitive development at age 3. It would be a very similar picture if we showed it for social and emotional development as well. So if this distribution was completely equal, we'd expect to see everybody in that hypothetical case at the 50th percentile. So deviations from that below this horizontal axis and above this horizontal axis describe the extent of inequality. So thinking about this income gradient in early development, once we control for differences in the environments in which children are raised, according to those classifications that I showed earlier, you can see that that income gradient is almost completely explained away. So what does that mean for policy? I think it's an important question for research and for practice, the extent to which we should be intervening on the upstream causes, so some of the big structural causes of inequality around income, or the extent to which we should be intervening in the more sort of proximal causes around early environments and finding interventions that work well in the early years. So our takeaway from this analysis is that just because these strong income gradients are explained, are very largely explained by differences in environments, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't intervene on income and thinking and poverty and only focus on environmental differences. But there's a very strong role for policy on both, and more research is needed on the exact sort of optimal balance between the two. So I said I'd return to genetic associations with early development, and this is quite a novel part of our analysis. As I said, the genetic data became available in this large population study for the first time during the course of the chapter. So it's clear that there are genetic associations with early development, and we've shown here on the left-hand chart the correlation between the polygenic risk score for education and child's cognitive and social and emotional development at age 3. It's also clear that genes are also correlated with environments. So once we control for the environmental factors that we observe, you can see that there is remaining associations between the genetic endowment and early development, but those are attenuated, and that's because genes and environments are correlated. And on the right-hand side, we've been able to look more explicitly at some of those gene environment correlations. So you can see, for example, in the middle of the chart, we have the correlation there between the polygenic risk score for education and the home learning index. So that measure of reading to the child and another number of aspects of that cognitive stimulation in the home. And it's quite natural to think that genes and environments should be correlated, both because the child's genes are correlated with the parent's genes, and also because parents may respond to the cognitive endowment of the child. In any case, if you recall the chart that I showed earlier, looking at the decomposition of the explanators of which variables most highly explain the variation in child development at age 3, you can see that those directly observed genetic variables only explain a small proportion of additional variation compared to the other factors that we observe. And in fact, the addition of genes into those models don't change the extent to which those other factors explain variations in child development much at all. So the findings are quite robust to the addition of genes as a control. I'll just go back. In terms of policy, and what does this mean for policy, which we spent quite a bit of time as a set of co-authors discussing in detail, I think irrespective of the roots of the inequality, there's clearly an imperative to intervene on environments, whatever their options. So there's no sort of sense of biological determinism or anything like that in any of these findings. So the final set of analyses I wanted to briefly discuss before handing over to Sarah is around early development and its lasting consequences. So here we've used the 1970 British cohort study and the age 42 sweep, and we've used developmental indicators and measures of the home environment at age 5. And you can see from the regression analysis on the left-hand side of my screen, where we're looking at 2 specific economic outcomes later in life, although in the chapter we show some other non-economic outcomes. You can see that the cognitive skills and social and emotional difficulties as captured at age 5 in the BCS 70 remain significantly correlated with outcomes all much later in life and up to midlife. These are in models where we're controlling for a whole range of early environments as well as early skills. So we can see from this that early development has long-lasting consequences. In terms of inequalities, on the right-hand side of the screen, we present results from a decomposition analysis where we look at the gap in weekly earnings at age 42 between those who grew up with low educated mothers compared to those who grew up in family homes with mothers who were more highly educated. So you can see from the green bar on the left that there's an average gap in weekly earnings of around £100 per week between those from high compared to low educated backgrounds. And some of that gap can be explained simply by differences in cognitive and social and emotional development by the age of 5. So you can see that gap reducing in our decomposition when we equalize early skills. An even bigger part of that gap is then explained when we account both for early skills and the home environment up till age 5. But then what you see from the final bar is when we add later skill development that's captured in the 1970 cohort during the primary and secondary schooling years, so through childhood and adolescence, then that gap between low and high educated mothers in terms of adult earnings is greatly reduced again. And so our policy takeaway from this part of our analysis is that while early intervention is clearly an incredibly important aspect of reducing inequalities across the life course, those interventions need to be sustained, and policy needs to focus both on early years inequalities and those which develop throughout childhood and adolescence. So that was my part of the presentation, and I'll stop sharing now and hand over to Sarah for the next part. Thank you.
Thank you, Alisa. So I'm going to pick up where you've just left things off and talk about essentially three more questions that we try to address in the chapter. So Alisa, sorry, I'm just figuring out. Yeah. So Alisa presented a picture of early childhood inequalities based on the Millennium Cohort studies. So a cohort born at the turn of the century. And the first question we want to ask is what's happened to early childhood inequalities over the past 20 years? Second, we'll be really interested in thinking about what's been driving these changes or lack of change inequalities over the past 2 decades, and especially what has been the role of policies affecting young children and their families in shaping these trends. And lastly, I want to try to conclude by taking stock of some of the key points emanating from the chapter that we believe should shape a policy agenda going forward that is aimed at reducing early childhood inequalities. So how have early inequalities evolved over the past 20 years? Well, this is actually not such an easy question to answer. And most of the difficulty relates really to the data or lack of data that could allow us to track the very early development of children, of successive cohorts of children in the UK. But I don't want to be too pessimistic here. We can still do something, albeit not perhaps as complete as we would like. And first, we can use administrative data from the early foundation stage profile. And these are data collected by teachers at the end of reception on children's development of a variety of dimensions included in the early years foundation stage profile. So the nice thing about this data is that they started being collected in the early 2000s and almost every year since then. Now, what is a bit less nice about this is that this data focus on the development of children after a year in school at the end of reception. So probably a bit later than we would ideally have liked when we think about early childhood development. And also the framework has changed in 2012-13, making comparisons over time slightly difficult. Now, we can also use cohort studies and compare the Millennium cohort to another cohort surveyed in what's called the Study of Early Education and Development, or SEED. And these data provide us with information on the development and the environments of children born between 2010 and 2012 in England, so just 10 years after the MCS. And luckily for us, it includes almost the same measures of cognitive and socio-emotional development as the ones present in the MCS. So this is a nice way to at least see how the early development of children has changed between the beginning and the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And so in this chapter, we start by doing that. And here are some of our results. So family income is not measured in the same way in SEED as it is in the MCS. So here we focus on measuring socioeconomic gaps by maternal education and area deprivation. So this graph reports gaps in cognitive development on the left and socio-emotional development on the right by maternal education and by area deprivation for each of the two cohorts, that's MCS and SEED. So comparing the two cohorts of children born in England around a decade apart, we see that socioeconomic gaps in early cognition and socio-emotional development at age 3 were remarkably stable in magnitude. There is no significant change in the gap in development between children with low and more highly educated mothers, and perhaps at best a small reduction in the gap between the most and least deprived areas between these two cohorts. So overall, perhaps a disappointing picture showing very little progress in reducing socioeconomic gaps in the development of 3-year-olds over the course of 10 years, especially despite the massive increase in public investment in the early years during that period. But of course, we don't know what would have happened without such investment. And as I will come to later on, there are reasons to believe
we seem to have lost Sarah, at least I have. Oh, there we go. She's back.
Oh, okay, great. I'll carry on. So Elisa emphasized the importance of children's environments as a driver of children's early development. So I want to turn to evidence on how gaps in environments change during this period. Again, comparing data from the SEED cohort born in 2010-12 to the MCS cohort born in 2000-2002. And although we know that on average, positive parenting practice, such as daily reading, have increased and become more frequent during this period, we see no shrinking of socioeconomic gaps in these sort of parenting practices, which are known to be very important for healthy development. What we do see, however, is a worsening of gaps in aspects of the material environment, so measured here, for example, by an increase in inequalities in homeownership, and also increases in inequalities in the emotional environment of children. For example, here shown by a slight increase in gaps in maternal psychological distress between the two cohorts. So coming back to a point I alluded to earlier, the fact that inequalities in early development did not exacerbate during this period, despite increasing gaps in inequalities in aspects of the children's environment, which are known to matter, does suggest that there may have been other factors at play that actually reduced inequalities. Now, before turning to what these factors might have been, I just would like to briefly mention what we think has happened during the last decade, so since the SEED cohort was born. And this is where the data becomes a bit more patchy, but we can try to get some clues first from the early years foundation stage profile. So this graph here plots the disadvantage gap in FSP early years foundation stage profile score between, and that's the gap essentially in scores between children ineligible for free school meals and children eligible for free school meal, which is often used as a measure of disadvantage. And this gap is plotted relative to the gap in the cohort in reception class in 2005-06, which roughly corresponds to the MCS cohort. And so according to this data, there would actually have been about 20% reduction in inequalities in age 5 development between the MCS and the SEED cohort. Although again, the measure is not exactly the same at these 2 points in time. But what we do see, if we look at what's happened after the SEED cohort, for the two cohorts for which we have data, so for academic years 2016-17 and 2017-18, we do see that the trend may have been reversing, with inequalities potentially increasing again. Now, the trend pretty much stops here because COVID hit in 2020, and the FSP was not collected during the pandemic. So what we know, but from what we know about how the pandemic has affected children and households with children, would suggest that inequalities have most likely continued to increase during this period. And perhaps we can dig a little bit deeper on this during the discussion. So now let me turn to discussing what role policy may have played in shaping these trends in early inequalities that I just discussed. So to answer this question, let's start by taking an overall look at public spending on early childhood over the past decades. By this, I mean spending both on early years services, such as childcare subsidies and things like Sure Start, and also cash benefits, such as maternity spending and child contingent benefits. Here, the work all funded by the Neufil Foundation that my colleague Christine Farquharson has been doing as part of the education spending report, and also the work that Kitty Stewart at LSE and several co-authors have been doing is really illuminating in highlighting broad trends in spending. So first, in terms of general trend, while there had been both large increases on both cash benefits and spending on services in the first decade of the century, public spending on early childhood has essentially fallen since 2011-12, and Stewart and Reeder estimate a 13% fall between 2011-12 and 2018-19. Another important point is that the composition of this funding has also changed in at least two notable ways. First, the funding has moved away from cash benefits towards relatively more spending on services for the early years. And second, there's also been a move away from spending on low-income families towards relatively more spending on working families. Now, these changes have been the result of a variety of policy changes, but I want to discuss three which I believe have played the largest role. Specifically, what's happened to the free entitlement to childcare. Second, what's happened to Sure Start. And third, what's happened to child contingent benefits. Starting with the free entitlement to childcare, which currently represents about 4 billion of annual spending, or about a quarter of all public spending on early childhood. So since the late 1990s, all 3- and 4-year-olds have been entitled to a free part-time childcare place. And there have been two additions to this universal policy since then. First, since 2013, disadvantaged 2-year-olds have also been entitled to a free part-time childcare place. And since 2017, all 3- and 4-year-olds of working families have been entitled to 30 hours. And this is for children of families where all parents are earning at least the equivalent of 16 hours per week worked at the national living wage. So these are important policy changes, and probably the only change that have contributed to actually an increase, where we've seen an increase in spending during the last 10 years. So what impact have these policies likely to have had on inequalities? Well, first, there is evidence that the free entitlement to a part-time childcare place has led to a small improvement in children's outcomes at age 5, though we do see greater impacts for disadvantaged children. So potentially, by allowing disadvantaged children to attend an earlier setting instead of staying at home at the age of 3, this policy may have reduced inequalities in early outcomes, as I said, measured at 5. However, the researchers who conducted this piece of work also find that these impacts are relatively short-lived and fade out by the age of 7. Now, turning to the 2-year-old entitlement, so this is a targeted subsidy for disadvantaged children. And so if it were effective at increasing the take-up of childcare among this group, and if this childcare was of high quality enough to benefit children's development, then we should think that this policy, can be quite effective at reducing inequalities in child development. However, so far, the evidence there that exists, at least to date, does suggest that the 2-year-old entitlement has only increased the take-up of early childcare and education to only very mildly, and a result done probably little to reduce inequalities in early development. Finally, While there is no evidence yet about the impact of the 30-hour extension on children's development and inequalities in development, the conditionality of that policy is such that families on the lowest incomes are not likely to be eligible. So again, probably doing little to reduce inequalities. So overall, unfortunately, we see little potential for the free entitlement policy, at least as it is currently designed, to play a significant role in reducing inequalities, despite it having been the biggest focus of policymakers over the past 10 years. Let me turn to another significant policy development in the last 2 decades, which is what's happened to SureStart. So SureStart was introduced in 1999 as a network of one-stop shops for families with children under the age of 5 that essentially provided a range of services, including parenting support, health services, early education, and care. And between 1999 and 2010, SureStart grew into a national network of over 3,500 centers spread across all areas of England, thanks to significant increases in public investments. Now, since 2010, we've seen a complete reversal of the policy, with funding being cut by at least 2/3 since its peak in 2010-11. Interestingly, in work that I've done with colleagues at UCL and IFS, we show that the expansion of the program actually had significant positive impacts on children's health, which are consistent with improvements in parenting and children's behavior reported in other evaluations. And most importantly, these impacts are concentrated in most deprived areas of the country. And this suggests that SureStart may have played a key role in reducing inequalities in children's outcome, both in early childhood and because we see impacts lasting actually over time in middle childhood and early adolescence as well. Obviously, the substantial reduction in funding will have likely caused a halt in this trend, and it's unclear whether the so-called family hub policy, which is also aimed at providing holistic support to families, may succeed in bringing similar impacts. Lastly, a word on changes to cash benefits for families with young children. So while spending on these benefits doubled during the Labour era, Reader and Stewart estimate cuts by 18% between 2011-12 and 2018-19. And these cuts have come from cuts equally affecting every child in families, but also cuts disproportionately affecting large families, such as the 2-child limit for tax credits and university credit passed in 2017. So overall, given the evidence on the role of family income for child development and the fact that these cuts disproportionately affected low-income families, we can expect these changes to have again exacerbated inequalities in children's outcomes. So where do we go from here? So to answer this question, I just want to reiterate a couple of key points the chapter emphasizes and that I believe should be cornerstones of a policy agenda aimed to reduce early inequalities. So first, the chapter brings together evidence about the fact that there are large inequalities between children already by the age of 3. The importance of the first 3 years of life, or the 1,000 days, as it's often coined, is increasingly on the policy agenda, but it has not always been. And this keeping it there and increasing this importance should be a priority. Second, the chapter emphasizes the importance of nurturing safe and stable environments to lay the foundations for children's healthy development. So investing in the educational, the emotional, and the material environment of children can yield a double dividend by not only improving children's skills early on, but also creating improved environments that will follow and support children throughout childhood. And again, this is at odds with policy changes over the last decade, which have mostly focused on enriching the environment outside of the home and on reducing financial resources available to low-income families to invest in creating this type of environment for their children. Finally, our analysis also shows that many aspects of children's environment matter for their cognitive, social, and emotional development. And many of these aspects are affected by poverty. And so this calls for integrated programs of service of services and or more generous cash benefits that can support families' specific and multiple needs. Unfortunately, both have been cut, and serious reversal of these trends are likely to be necessary if we want to bring inequalities down. Together, I think this suggests at least two key priorities. First, the key priority should be around finding the right set of policies to reduce inequalities in key aspects of children's educational, emotional, and material environments. And that includes parenting support, strong mental health care for parents from the period of infancy, and the provision of stable and high quality housing. And in light of the significant fraction of current spending on early years education and childcare, especially through the free entitlement, a priority should be around redressing the regressivity of the current system by ensuring that investment in childcare focuses on increasing the take-up and or increasing the quality of childcare available to disadvantaged children. I will stop here, but I'll be very happy to pick up on some of these points during the discussion. Thank you.
We're expecting Kerry. Kerry, are you there?
I am. I'm just, yes, I'll be 2 seconds. I'm just trying to use my camera, which I don't seem to be able to do, but that's fine. Ah, lovely. Okay, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm also just checking that I've got my slides. Thank you for inviting me. Alyssa and Sarah's presentation really highlight just the depth.
Sorry, Kerry, you don't seem to be sharing your slides.
Ah, okay. Can we just hold on 1 second? Let me just. Right. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Excellent. Right, start again. So it's really clear as you listen to Alyssa and Sarah's presentation that the depth of the investigation that they and colleagues have undertaken into the nature of early childhood inequalities and how much they influence later life chances on the one hand, but also the complexity and the challenges in addressing them. The paper is packed, as you can see, with insights and data and really is a must read. We draw upon this analysis heavily in the work that we've been doing at the Nuffield Foundation on early childhood. And the work we've been doing, we've titled The Changing Face of Early Childhood. It explores the ways in which the lives of young children and their families have changed over the last 2 decades and how we should respond. We've drawn upon 90 plus Nuffield Foundation funded research projects, of which this is one, and multiple other studies, distilling the research and drawing out common themes and really importantly, and I think this comes out very clearly from what people have said, taking a holistic approach to young children's lives. And the aim is really to try to enable practitioners, policymakers and researchers to think afresh across the boundaries of professional expertise, departmental silos and research specialities. So here you can see the evidence reviews that we've undertaken, and they range from how family lives are changing, the risks for young children of abuse and neglect, poverty, early years and childcare, health and parenting. And alongside these reviews, we've also engaged with experts in the field and with parents themselves. It's been very much an interactive process, and we've learned much from the conversations. Today, I'm just going to share a small selection of insights and then reflect on the policy opportunities and challenges which arise from the research that Alyssa and Sarah have presented. So there have been a number and many striking changes in the lives of young children over the last 2 decades, but of course also continuities. And I think it's useful to bear this in mind as we think about the complex range of different factors that are shaping early childhood inequalities. I'm going to focus briefly on the 4 changes that are listed in this slide. So we see changing family forms, and this chart in fact uses another from the Deaton Review's outputs, which is also published today by Cattan and colleagues. And it shows the declining share of births to married couples, that's in the green bars, and an increasing share to cohabiting couples in black bars. And we also see a steadyish proportion of births to parents who are not living together, purple, though this is high by international standards. And importantly, these families are also more geographically concentrated in deprived areas and particular parts of the country. And while family forms don't determine children's outcomes, Kiernan shows the association between family form and access to resources, so more for married couples than cohabiting couples, and lone parents the least. And that, of course, in turn can influence children's development and well-being, as we've just seen through the slides. More children are having experience of a change in the relationship status of their parents, whether that's separation or repartnering. But there's also a lot that the data doesn't tell us, particularly in relation to more complex family arrangements and also in relation to fathers. The second change is really that what has become the new norm, that the majority of mothers with a child under 4 are combining care and paid work. And that's both been driven by a range of factors, including the rise in women's educational levels, but also some of the policy changes, which I'm not going to go on into, but that are listed on the slide. And there's also data indicating that there's been an increase in the proportion of children under 5 living in households where all adults work full time. So I think this raises questions about, firstly, the gender divide in relation to care of young children, but also how families are coping in terms of time, pressures, stresses for mothers in particular, but also for relationships between partners and with children. And then the third change is, and that's been clear, and people will be obviously familiar with this, which is the experience of formal early education and childcare, which has become a near universal experience. And we see sort of high take-up levels for 3- and 4-year-olds in terms of being over 90%. Those are the purple and black lines, but also notably the fall since the pandemic. And then we see the 2-year-old disadvantaged offer, which has, where the take-up is lower, considerably lower, but has grown, but then a really marked fall since COVID. And work by Jane Lewis and colleagues, which was published earlier this week on COVID and childcare, has also shown that childcare attendance is lower in deprived areas, also in areas where there is higher unemployment. And it also shows that children in ethnic minority families and those with special educational needs were most likely to have missed out on early childhood education and care during the pandemic. So the worry is that the children who have most to gain from good quality early years provision are even less likely to be accessing it in the light of the pandemic. And this chart, which is drawn from the work that Kitty Stewart and Mary Reeder have done at the LSE, shows rates of relative poverty for families with a young child. And that's the lines in green and black. And those rates are higher than for older children over the whole period, the last 20 years. And that the rates, if you look at the rates of poverty for families with young children, they have been rising since 2013-14. There's a slight fall, but it now stands at 36%. That's pre-COVID, well over a third. And for some groups, particularly ethnic minority groups, that figure is much higher. If you look at Bangladeshi families with a young child under 5, that's over 70%. And that these changes reflect some of the things that Sarah talked about, a number of factors, but particularly some of the benefit and tax credit changes over the last decade, which have particularly hit large families, including the 2-child limit. And the concern is particularly in relation to young children facing persistent poverty combined with other kinds of disadvantage and material deprivation, maybe something we'll come back to in the discussion. So just briefly, standing back from the changes in young children's lives, I just wanted to briefly think about the opportunities and challenges in relation to improving young children's well-being and life chances. So on the left, these are some of the opportunities, and I think there are a range of important developments coming out of government, some of which are listed here, indicating a renewed interest in early childhood, and importantly, in terms of Best Start for Life, an emphasis on those first 1001 days that Sarah talked about. Obviously, there are all sorts of issues about how those initiatives are implemented and the funding that lies behind them. Again, something we might return to. There are also, I think, a number of wider initiatives that are coming from society, wider society, whether that's parent groups or whether it's the voluntary sector, with a lot of emphasis and I think raising the visibility of young children. So on the challenges, I wanted to just reflect on a few things. So Alyssa and Sarah's findings, and they're really striking, which is about the interconnection also between different domains of children's development. The relationship between cognitive and social and emotional development and how they combine. And although they didn't speak about it in this presentation, but it's in the paper, they combine to both either compound disadvantage or compounded advantage. And I was really struck by the importance of the emotional environment and yet how difficult policy actually finds to target that. What they don't look at, and the data is problematic, is physical development. And that, of course, is a third core domain of development and interacts with the other domains. And COVID has illuminated this very sharply, where we see increases in young children who are overweight or obese, sleep difficulties, delayed physical skills, and these clearly also interact with those other domains of development. And I think that really is a very important insight, and it relates to the big gap between how young children develop and the way in which services, data, policy departments connect up. I think if we are going to make a difference and help narrow some of those inequalities, we really need to get to grips with that. And that means thinking about policy-related policies, poverty-related policies and housing, alongside the things that are more traditionally thought about in relation to the early years. So alongside early education, health and social care. We also see that the policy service gap for 0 to 3s is really notable. So there's no free universal early years education or childcare until the age of 3. There are fairly limited developmental checks carried out by health visitors after the age of 2. We've seen the benefit cuts described by Sarah, some of which have had a particular effect on families with a young child. And then I think importantly, and not discussed so far, is the role of paid parental leave, which stops after 6 to 9 months, and that it is also about the level that it stands at. And I think that just pinpoints the importance of time as a resource, and how we might find ways of mitigating some of the pressures and psychological stresses that parents with young children are facing. Then there's the issue of really trying to understand and tailor high quality early years in childcare for disadvantaged children and their families. How do we sort of work alongside parents and carers to both increase the quality and the take-up of that provision? And then home-based programs. The paper talks about quite a number of those programs. So given the importance of the home learning environment and the relationships within families, we need to think more about how we develop the evidence base and the experience of delivering programs to people within their homes. And I think, Sarah, you talked about an emphasis particularly on policies being outside the home for young children, illustrated by the spending on early years and childcare. But I think it's important to think about the interaction between services in, say, childcare and early years services and what goes on at home. How can good early years settings help parents in terms of how they parent at home and their home learning environment? There's, I think, a really important relationship that we could build on. And then finally, the relationship really between what needs to happen at a national level and what needs to happen at a local level. And some things are only solved at the centre. So if we're thinking about poverty reduction, issues around social security policy need to be solved at the centre, but that needs to be complemented by much more localised as well as joined up approaches. And of course, all of this has been made much more urgent by COVID and the cost of living crisis that we're dealing with. So I'm going to stop there just to say, if you'd like to find out more about the work we're doing, do go and look at our website. We're just about to publish a final report in a couple of weeks' time, which I hope you will explore. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alyssa, Sarah and Kerry. Alyssa and Sarah, if you could put your cameras on, that'd be lovely. That was incredibly interesting set of results. And as Kerry mentioned, and I should have mentioned at the beginning, we've also published today work by Cattan on the role of families in inequality. We do have now half an hour to go through some of the questions, and there are quite a number of rather nice questions here, and get into a bit of a discussion about some of the issues that have been raised. And as I said, I'm going to start with those that are most popular, though, to put people's minds at risk. Yes, the slide decks that you've just seen will be available on the website after we finished. The first question is, and I don't know whether any of you feel that you've got the information to answer this, but it's about the type of work that mothers do, whether it's shift work, the hours, and so on. Do we know anything about the relationship between the type of work that mothers are participating in and how that relates to time spent with their child and their psychological well-being and so on? Does any of you want to have a go at that? I mean, if not, just we might have to push on to the next question. Kerry.
Yes, I don't think we've got very good information about the relationship between the type of work and care for young children and psychological well-being. We do know that work-life conflict and tensions and mental health is more of a difficulty and prevalent when you're looking after a young child. And we do know, obviously, that there are big differences, you know, in terms of the type of work that people are doing and the impact that that has on on pressures and stresses. So, you know, if parent, and we know there's an increase in insecurity and self-employment. So I can't give you figures about the relative proportion of, I mean, we do actually know that actually women that are going into paid work are actually often from higher socioeconomic groups in terms of maintaining their relationship with the labour market. But those who are going to be working in more precarious work or combining different kinds of work, you know, more than one job, that's clearly going to be filtering into their psychological well-being and pressures at home, and the way that then in turn, you know, impacts on relationships and relations with children. And we do know that, and there's very good evidence for that.
Can I just come in here and just add a couple of things, like to build on Kerry's answer? So I agree with you. At least I don't know of work that looks at the relationship between the type of work and time spent with children. What we do know, and we've actually done some analysis on this on the MCS cohort with colleagues at IFS, we look at the relationship between the working hours of mothers and the time that is spent with their children on sort of activities that we think, you know, are good for child development, like reading and playing and, you know, these sort of things. And what we see here is actually the difference is the gradient, you know, is much more related to maternal education than it is to hours worked. And in fact, we see that, you know, the time that mothers spend on these sort of things, like on these sort of activities with their children, is higher among working mothers than it is among non-working mothers. Perhaps among the high SES or highly educated like mothers, we see that those who work part-time spend slightly more time doing these things with their children than those who are working part-time. But really the biggest difference is not, you know, related to hours worked across the whole spectrum. And I think that very much, you know, suggests like what Kerry was alluding to, that it's perhaps a little bit less a question of, you know, the time really available in the day to do these things, but more a question around, you know, how stressed like actually parents are, and that will be linked to their economic situation and their feeling of economic security. And it may also be linked to, you know, parental beliefs about the importance of doing these sort of things like with their children to promote their development.
Great, thank you. I mean, a point which is of at least some relevance to this, which has come out of other work that we've done for the Deaton review, is about the value of part-time work in terms of longer-term earnings, and it is extraordinary how little value it seems to have. If you move into part-time work, it seems to do almost as much damage to your long-term earnings capacity as spending a significant amount of time out of the labour market. So that's been a very striking finding from some of the other work we've done as part of this review. Now, swiftly bid up to the top of the list is a question that we have talked about quite a lot, actually. So I think Alyssa or Sarah will be able to take this one on, and it's about the role of genes. In fact, there are two here about the role of genes. To what extent is I think the key question here is that you've used polygenic scores, but twin studies show stronger genetic effects than you're showing there. So is that something you might have brought out a bit more? And then there's also a question about the extent to which the effect of genes could be magnified in poor as opposed to rich families. Which of you would like to have a shot at that one, or those two?
So I'll start, and then Sarah, please do just jump in. Or so certainly, if you take a look at the chapter, we do have quite a careful discussion around the findings that come from twin studies, and the differences when you're using, like we do, the observed molecular genetic differences at the individual level. And it certainly is the case that with the current state of measurement and technology and so on with the polygenic scores, that it explains a lower proportion of the variation in developmental outcomes than the twin studies do, and most likely in the fullness of time will become more successful at explaining more of it. So we do quite carefully sort of caveat and discuss our results in the chapter with respect to that. In terms of like the key sort of takeaways in findings, I think that's why we're sort of quite careful to in terms of policy recommendations, that of course whatever the source of the variation, the intervention is on the environments, and the extent to which policy interventions can or in future would be sensitive to differences in genetics and that sort of feedback is something that I think needs a lot more thought. But in any case, yes, I think we agree with that question. And in terms of those interactions between poverty and genes, it's not something that we looked at in this research. And I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything in particular to say on that, or.
No, I think that that's quite an active area of research in behavioral genetics, like to really look at the sort of interactions between gene and environments. The sort of latest research I know on this, but again, I may be missing quite a bit of evidence, is sort of really looking at sort of whether, genetic predispositions or more sort of, beneficial genetic predisposition enhance the effect of investments, and or whether sort of mitigates their impact. And that's this sort of interactions and their nature that's really sort of crucial at answering this type of question that was raised on Slido, in terms of whether these genetic inequalities at birth are essentially whether they're going to exacerbate or mitigate inequalities in environments. And I don't have a firm answer, and I think this could be quite different when we think also about different types of investments. So just really a very active area of research at the moment.
I'm going to go right to the bottom of Slido, actually. There's a question here which I'm quite interested in. I'm initially at least going to direct it at Kerry. And it's a question about policy. And the questioner, Tammy Campbell, asked, why do the speakers think policy is focused so much on intervention outside the home? And what assumptions about parents and their capabilities underpin this? And I guess it's a question really about the extent to which government can or should try to change the within-home environment, and how easy or difficult that might be, and how politics might play into that sort of question. Kerry, do you want to have a first shot at that one?
Yes, it's a great question. I think, I think the focus has been very much on early years and childcare, partly reflecting the changes in women's aspirations and wanting to be in paid work, and of course also needing to be in paid work increasingly, and that in a way that the kind of intervention began with really early education and an understanding about the importance of early education for young children's development, and then in policy terms over those sort of 25 years gradually expanded to really focus on how to combine these really things that are sometimes in tension, which is, how to enable people to get to be in work and what kind of provision they need to support that in relation to women in particular. And then also what's best for children's development. And then, of course, we've had kind of policy kind of layered on each other over that period of time, which has hugely increased the complexity of the system. And I think that, of course, there is also a reluctance, as you said, Paul, to intervene, within the home, that this is sort of the private sphere, unless children are at risk. I mean, that's traditionally where kind of policies sort of, if we think 25 years ago, there was much more reluctance, but that has been changing, and we have had things like the family nurse partnerships, which is a very intense intervention, for young parents, disadvantaged parents, with, some good results in relation to their kind of children's early learning, but mixed results in relation to other aspects that the programme is geared to. So I think that, it's also easier to kind of build on, if you start with schools, it's easier to think about early education because it's an institutional model that we're sort of familiar with. I think there are challenges. So, given your findings about the importance of what goes on in the home, about the design of those interventions, and also who's helping to deliver them. So, what kind, so health visitors, who are the home visitors that are going to help support that? And that's why I felt it was also really important to stress, given that we've got a fairly universal early years and childcare service, that's a really important sort of infrastructure on which we can work alongside parents in terms of supporting their parenting and activities and so on.
So Sarah, did you want to come in on that one?
Can I just say a few words relating to Tammy's question, which is, in our discussions of policy throughout the kind of the drafting of the chapter and the discussions we've had around it, issues around access have come up sort of all the time. So the idea that however you might design a policy, differential access and who's going to reach out and take advantage of it is pervasive in the sort of issue. And so I think that sort of idea that there may be kind of political divides around whether it's appropriate to intervene in the family home, but there's also like real challenges of succeeding in doing that and doing that successfully for those who are most in need, which doesn't mean that there aren't also parallel sort of issues around outside of home care. But maybe for those in most difficulty, that can be sort of magnified. So I think probably all routes in are needed in order to get those who are hardest in reach, but possibly most at need.
Great. Shall we move on? So I'm going to, again, just pick and mix the question. I think we'll stick with a policy question again. Sarah, you might want to start on this one. The question is simply, I thought the evidence on Sure Start was much more contested than you imply. Is it contested, or are we really genuinely confident that Sure Start had very positive effects?
So having done quite a bit of research on Sure Start, I hope it's not too contested, and I don't believe it's to be contested, but I'll elaborate a little bit more on this. So they were essentially, while Sure Start was rolled out, there were essentially two evaluations of Sure Start local programs and Sure Start children's centers. Those, I would say, the methodology that was used was perhaps not the most robust. Was not the most robust methodology, but it did suggest that at least on aspects measuring, parenting practice and sort of family functioning, there were indeed, benefits from Sure Start. Now, I think these evaluations did not find impacts on children's outcomes, but this is where this recent study that I conducted with colleagues at IFS and UCL comes in, and in work that we published starting in 2019, we actually looked at the impact of the expansion of Sure Start on children's hospitalization. So that's quite a hard outcome measured in administrative data and data on all the hospital admissions. in England, and we actually see that over throughout really the primary school and even into early adolescence, we see reductions in hospitalizations that we can quite confidently attribute to the expansion of Sure Start. So from that evidence, and I won't get into the details, but all the research is on the IFS website. We're pretty confident that Sure Start did have really positive impacts on the health of children, and those impacts are actually quite long-lasting. Now, when we look a little bit further in the types of hospitalizations that were avoided by the expansion of Sure Start, I think we start getting clues about what aspects of Sure Start might have actually driven those impacts. And we do believe that this has a lot to do with improvements in the behavior and the emotional health of children, and that is likely to be also related to an improvement in parenting practice. And this is where I think we start seeing a link between the research that we did and those earlier evaluations. Now, we're currently doing more work on this using the same robust methodology to look at impacts on school outcomes, so attainment, absence, exclusion. We'll also be looking at offending, and all these new results will come out over the next year. Starting, I think, in October, we'll publish a report on the impacts of Sure Start on school outcomes.
Brilliant, thank you. Kerry, did you want to add anything to that from the big reviews of evidence that you've been looking at? Did that tell you something about the robustness of the various evaluations of Sure Start?
No, and I don't really have. I mean, I think Sarah's expressed it really clearly.
Great. Lovely. Well, let's move to the top of the pops again. Question about the relationship between material and emotional educational environment. I mean, and unpicking those pathways, given the two are related, is there a danger of underestimating the contribution of material environment to the to the impacts on early childhood development? Alyssa or Sarah, one or other of you, probably well placed to answer that.
I think that related to my presentation, so I'm happy to start, and then Sarah, please do jump in. And I did really want to say it's nice to see everyone. I'm sorry I didn't turn on my camera during my presentation. It was only afterwards when I saw Paul's comment to switch it on. I thought, so anyway, I hope that I hope I'm making up for it now with the camera on. It's a good point. So that decomposition analysis is a multivariate analysis. So it's showing a sort of contribution of different elements controlling for other ones. I hope the person who posed the question saw, as we went through the presentation and discussed sort of the policy implications, that we do talk about housing sort of fairly consistently throughout the chapter, and sort of quality and stability of housing and the environments in which children live and so on is a really key aspect of policy. And I think, so if you think about the analysis that I showed around the income gradients, so those big differences by income that are then sort of explained when you control for differences in environment, I think if we'd done one on housing, you would have seen something quite similar. So although that sort of net contribution explained wasn't very high, that doesn't mean that, that doesn't imply that isn't a primary sort of target for policy, and probably an absolutely sort of fundamental building block for stability and well-being of children is their housing, their home, the neighbourhood, and so on. So that one sort of piece of analysis, it needs to be taken in the sort of context of the wider chapter, and I would agree with the point of the question.
Okay, can I ask directly on that, Alyssa? You showed a chart of relationship between housing tenure and income and so on. Do we have any evidence on whether actually the fact of being a renter whilst a parent has a negative effect on mental well-being and so on? Because clearly there's been an enormous increase in the fraction who are private renters and having children over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, So it's interesting when you look at just to elaborate on the last thing you said, when some of the big differences between the seed cohort, so the cohort born more recently compared to MCS, was a really sort of big shift towards renting and lower rates of home ownership. In terms of we have to, there are correlations between. So there's some distinguishing between social renting and private renting, and then acknowledging the differences in composition now as more families rent than did. There are certainly strong correlations between social renting and lower developmental outcomes, which I think again have a strong relationship with their associations with other things like socioeconomic deprivation and so on. So in terms of like the specifics around tenure, causal impacts of tenure as opposed to, you know, those being sort of markers of other things. We didn't look into that in our chapter, but I don't know, Sarah, did you want to add anything sort of in more detail about that?
No, I don't think, but at least I don't know of very conclusive evidence. So sort of really looking at the causal effect of renting versus homeowning, and whether that's would have to do more with just the stability of housing versus renting per se versus owning, or the material condition of a property that is rented versus owned. I think the evidence that I know is more around a sort of these sort of housing vouchers. They've been sort of given through lottery to groups of families, and that have helped them move to better neighborhoods and probably better housing conditions, and that have had like impacts on children's outcomes, actually quite long-lasting impacts. But it's sort of it's difficult to unpack, whether it's the effect of living in a better house, living in a better neighborhood, or also through that move, the sort of impact that it may have had on parental employment opportunities, on parental mental health, all these other things. So that, I think, remains really to unpack, and should probably be quite a priority for research.
Okay, we're almost at the end. I'm going to again go down to the bottom of the list. You've talked a lot about mothers, but not much about fathers, and I wonder if each of you would just like to say a last couple of words on that particular question, if you'd like, or in answer to any of the other questions here. But we've got 1 minute each, so why don't we go Kerry first, and then Sarah, and then Alyssa.
So I would just say, firstly, it still is, and maybe Alyssa and Sarah will correct me, the data on fathers is still quite limited, and there's we really need to be able to fill that gap. So to understand that, I think the gender gap in relation to how men and women combine work and care is really important. So if we're going to find our way through trying to reduce some of the burden and pressures of it falling still largely on women, then we're going to have to think much more imaginatively, I think, both about policy, but also about part-time working, and making it, and interesting what you said earlier, Paul, about how those can be skilled jobs that allow progression, that and how we share, in a sense, the kind of the wage penalty that happens as a result of looking after children.
So very much agree with these points. I think there is some evidence actually coming out from a really nice Australian longitudinal study on the importance of paternal time as well as maternal time for children's development throughout childhood, not even only in early childhood. And I think that very much links to some of also the gender issues that are discussed in the other chapter of the review on gender. And that links back to a point that maybe we don't address enough, like in the chapter, but that should really be, I think, thought about going forward, which is around like maternity leave and paternity leave and how this is shared. I think that the recent policies have not necessarily been that successful at bringing a lot of fathers like to take paternity leave. But if we want more equal sort of time like spent with children, I think it needs to start from very early on.
Thanks, Paul. I think I'd agree that some of that omission is data driven, and that there is strong research that does emphasize the importance of fathers. It's interesting because we're in the process of trying to establish a new birth cohort study for the UK, and working really hard to find ways to engage fathers sort of from the outset as fundamentally as we can, so they can have a stronger voice in this kind of research. And that's not just fathers in the family home from the outset, but there's sort of fairly large proportion of children for whom their father is not resident from birth, and capturing that voice in these analyses is an ideal that we're aspiring to.
Brilliant. Look, we are bang on 11:30, so thank you so much to Sarah, to Alyssa, and to Kerry. That was just a fantastic and a very comprehensive set of analysis and presentations. I certainly learned a huge amount. This is a really important input to the whole Deaton review, actually. If we're looking at inequalities across society, my goodness, we need to understand both how inequalities perpetuate through what happens in early childhood, and how what happens in early childhood leads to further inequalities. So thank you particularly to the Nuffield Foundation once again for funding. Thank you to everyone who's attended this online event, and we have quite a lot more coming out soon. So I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.